Well, Douglas Murray is the author of 7 books, including The War on the West and The Strange Death of Europe. He joins Rita every week and he's with me now. Douglas, perhaps the most important speech given anywhere in the world this week came from UK Home Secretary Suella Braverman. She told an audience in Washington that the migrant crisis currently facing the Western world is a result of outdated human rights laws. Have a listen.
Who we allow to come into our country and become one of us is a fundamental issue. Without public consent, immigration is illegitimate. Dismissing as idiots or bigots those members of the public who express legitimate concerns is not merely unfair, it is dangerous. Europe is at a critical juncture. The EU must find a way to meet the challenge of illegal migration, because failure to do so I fear, undermine the legitimacy of democratic institutions and create the conditions for more extreme politics.
Douglas, it was a great speech. She went on to argue that the United Nations Refugee Convention, set up after the Second World War, is completely outdated and needs to be overhauled if the crisis is ever to end. Is she right, and why?
She's absolutely right. And thank goodness a prominent politician in a leading democracy has actually finally said this. Australia led the way in this 10 years ago under the Abbott government, when it famously, as everyone watching knows, started the turn around the boats policy. But Australia is very unusual in being a country that's, first of all, of course, geographically much more isolated than many other countries in the world. And secondly, actually having had governments that wanted to protect and defend the country's borders. But of course, Europe and Britain and America are in a totally different situation today. That millions and millions, literally hundreds of millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa alone wish to move to Europe. And we see the consequences of this every week. And the reality is that Europe cannot take them in. It's the same with people flooding across the southern border of the United States. And the thing that Suella Braverman was so brave to address was to say, look, everybody knows this is the case. Every democracy is going through this problem in some form. And the problem is that we are living with an outdated system. The UN Convention set up after World War II, first of all, it insisted that you prioritize people who actually had legitimate asylum claims, not people who simply had less of a good standard of living than we do in the West, not simply that you had a fear of potential persecution somewhere down the road, but a real persecution going on. The second thing is, we now live in a world where ease of movement means that you can get from Venezuela to New York City in not very much time at all. And the third thing is, of course, smartphones, cell phones have changed everything. Everyone can communicate and see what the rest of the world is like. And much of the developing world wants to move to the developed world. And the developed world realistically just cannot take them. And that was what Braverman was pointing to this week. I'm delighted she did point to it. And it's about time.
The Home Secretary has also claimed that people are gaming the system to gain asylum in Britain. Specifically, she said some are pretending to be gay. Here's what she said.
What we see operationally is that people do game the system. They come to the UK, they purport to be homosexual in the effort to game our system, in the effort to get special treatment. That's not fair and it's not right.
Really. Now, Douglas, ITV News political editor Robert Peston tweeted that the PM should distance himself from those comments. What are your thoughts?
I mean, that is such a journalistic game, isn't it, doing that? I mean, Robert Peston is really just playing a political activist role at this stage. The Home Secretary gives a speech, makes a perfectly valid point in an interview, and immediately the low-grade interviewer in question decides to try to make another news story by claiming there's clear water between the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary when there isn't. The other thing is, people like Peston, the interviewer there, genuinely seem to know nothing about what is actually happening. I've traveled to the countries people are fleeing from, and I've traveled all across the countries that people are fleeing to. And I can say with absolute certainty, because I've seen it myself, there are many people who game the system or try to game the system by pretending to be gay when they're not. That isn't to say that there aren't gay people who are fleeing persecution. Likewise, there are many people, particularly from the Middle East, who have claimed in recent years when they enter Europe that they are Christians when they are in fact Muslims. I've met people doing this myself in suburbs of Germany and refugee camps. I've seen people who have been taught these are the things you say if you want to get asylum. I don't understand why so many left-wing journalists who are so uninterested in this subject are genuinely amazed that people would cross a continent and then fib about something. It's not to say that everyone's a liar. It's saying, of course, you are going to have people gaming the system. And the Home Secretary is saying, oh, do we want to be the mugs here? Or do we want to face up to these realities? She wants to face up to the realities, but plenty of these activist left-wing journalists simply don't.